Let's start and finish a cardigan in less than 3 days. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to crochet a chunky, cozy cardigan step by step, and in just a few days, you can be styling your new sweater. Hi, I'm Jess from Make and Do Crew, and we've designed this pattern for you in sizes extra small through 5X. And while I'm going to walk you through all the techniques and skills you need to make your own 3 days to done sweater, you'll want to follow along with a written pattern to know the exact stitch counts for your size. All the pattern links are down below in the description box. If you love fast projects as much as I do, definitely check out the other patterns in our 3 days to done collection. Each of these can be finished over a long weekend, and they're really awesome for just a little gift of self-care to make something to wear yourself, or they also are perfect for gifts when you really need something last minute that feels meaningful, but you don't have a lot of time to make it. Each of the 3 days to done patterns includes a step-by-step video tutorial just like this, so even if you're newer to reading crochet patterns, I will walk you through each skill that you need in order to start and finish your project really quickly. To make this sweater, I'm going to be using a yarn from Lion Brand called Re-Spun Thick and Quick. And this is a category 6 super bulky weight yarn. And I want to point out something here because I think there could be an easy mistake to make, and I want to help you avoid that. So there's also a very popular yarn from Lion Brand called Woolly's Thick and Quick. And it would be pretty easy to think that you could just substitute this yarn for this yarn. But actually, what I have found is that Woolly's Thick and Quick is quite a bit heavier than Re-Spun, even though this is also a category 6 yarn. So if you were to use Woolly's Thick and Quick for your pattern, it's likely that you're going to end up with a bigger and chunkier sweater than if you use Re-Spun. Of course, it's important to make a gauge swatch in any case, no matter what yarn you're using, and I'll walk you through how to do that in a second. But if you don't have access to Re-Spun Thick and Quick, I have some yarn substitutes listed in the written pattern so that you can see what's available in your area. And I also suggest going to yarnsub.com and looking up what's the most equivalent weight yarn that you can get your hands on. If you would like your sweater to have some cool color blocking action going on, you're going to want to have more than one color, obviously. And in the pattern, I've included a little worksheet you can use to play with your colors and kind of map out how you want your color blocks to work before you start crocheting. I'm using a size N 10mm hook to crochet this cardigan, but the size that you need is very dependent on your own stitch tension, which is why we're going to measure our gauge in a minute. And if you find that yours is a little smaller or a little larger than what's listed in the pattern, it's definitely okay to change your hook size in order to meet the pattern gauge. Meeting the same tension as what's in the pattern is what's more important, not what hook size you use to get there. You'll also want to have lots of stitch markers available to mark your place in your project and also hold your pieces together as you're seaming them. A tapestry needle for joining our sweater together and weaving in any yarn tails. But don't worry, we're actually going to be using our ends to seam our pieces together, so there are very few extra yarn tails to weave in. And if you'd like your cardigan to have buttons, you're going to want about 4 buttons. These are size 28mm, which is 1 1/8 inches. Of course, you can use something a little bit bigger, that will work too. Probably not too much smaller because they won't really fit the scale of your chunky cardigan. If you do want to add buttons, you'll also want to have a sewing needle and some thread that matches your button color. And just a heads up, in this tutorial, you are going to see me jumping between 2 differently colored samples, and that is simply because I love to start projects and I can't help myself. So I have 2 of the same sweater pattern in progress right now, so I thought it might be fun for you to get to see both colors in action. So you're just going to see us bouncing between both as we learn the skills to make your own. The first step when making any garment is checking your gauge. And if you've taken our no-fail garments course, you know this through and through. And right now we're going to check our gauge by creating what can be a pocket if you would like. It doesn't have to be a pocket, but if you want to reuse it later on, you may want to make your gauge swatch out of the color you would like to use for your pockets. So think about what the front of your sweater is going to look like and then choose a color accordingly for your gauge swatch. We are going to start with 15 chains to create this little square. When we're starting that foundation chain, if you do think you might want to use this for a pocket, you might want to leave a long tail just in case you need part of it for seaming I like to get in the habit of leaving myself these long tails so that I can use the yarn that's left over for sewing if I need to. So at this point I have 15 chains, and I am now going to show you how to work all the tall rows of our pattern. So a gauge swatch is important because it helps make sure that your stitches are going to turn out the same size as what's listed in the pattern. That's what's going to result in your sweater being the same size that you expect. But it's also a great opportunity to learn the stitch pattern in something that doesn't matter much. So we're just going to practice our stitches here. And the first stitch we're going to learn is extended double crochet. So I'm skipping my first 2 chains, and extended double crochet is very similar to a regular double crochet. We're just going to make it a little taller. It has 1 extra step. So it starts with a yarn over and inserting my hook and pulling up a loop just as we would with double crochet. And then I want to yarn over and pull through just the first loop on my hook. So that's the extra step. Now we're going to yarn over and pull through the first 2 loops, and yarn over again and pull through the last 2 loops. So that is an extended double crochet. Let's try it again. We've got a yarn over, insert our hook, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through the first loop only. That's the extension. Now we're going to yarn over and pull through the next 2 loops, and again yarn over and pull through the next 2. Yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop. We've got 3 loops now. Yarn over and go through that first loop. It's kind of like working a chain stitch. Then yarn over and pull through the next 2 and the next 2. So we want to extended double crochet in each stitch we have left in this foundation chain. So that's a yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through. So there's 3 little steps here. After you have your loops on your hook, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through. This is a very fun and fast stitch, and it makes a stitch that's a little bit taller than a double crochet. So when we want to make a garment fast, this is a great stitch to do it because it grows very quickly, and it has some nice drape because it's taller and just a little less dense than double crochet. At the end of the row, it's a great idea to count your stitches and make sure you have 13. This chain 2 that we skipped at the beginning of our row is never going to count as a stitch. So we're not counting that. It's helpful to just count the posts of each stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. When you're sure you have 13 stitches, we're going to move on to row 2, and every even row in the pattern using the main stitch is going to be worked exactly the same. And we begin with a chain 1, and then we're only working in the back loop from now on. So in each row of our gauge swatch and then in the main pattern, from row 2 and beyond, we're only working under this loop that's farthest away from us. It's always the one that's farthest away is the back loop. So I am going to work a back loop only yarn over slip stitch. What that means is I start with a yarn over, insert my hook in that back loop, pull up a loop, so there's 3 loops on my hook, and then I want to take my first loop and pull it through the second 2. So I'm just pulling that one through. That looks like this. Yarn over, insert my hook in that back loop, yarn over and pull through. So there's 3 loops now, and I'm taking my first loop, passing it through the next 2. So yarn over, insert your hook and pull up a loop. There's 3, and pull the first one through the next 2. 3 loops and pull it through. So slip stitches have a tendency to get a little tight. I'm going to show you what I mean. If you're not pulling them up very high, they can get a little scrunched down, and it might start to feel pulled a little bit tight. That's when you know you need to deliberately loosen up your slip stitches. It's just the nature of slip stitches to get a little tight. The way that you compensate for that is when you pull up your loops, you just make sure they're not super squished down like this. You just pull your loop up a little bit. Nothing extreme. You just want to have a little bit of flow there, and then you can pull that first loop through the next 2. So while I'm doing it slowly, it looks a little more clunky, but actually a yarn over slip stitch can be worked very fluidly, just like this. You're actually just grabbing that loop and pulling it under the second 2 loops on your hook. So we want to work one of these yarn over slip stitches in the back loop of every stitch, and I want to point out where our last stitch is because it's a little bit hard to see since we're not counting these chain 2s as a stitch. We want to look for our last V right here. It's a little hard to see on camera, but if I put my hook right there, you can see there's 2 lines of that V. That's where our last stitch is, and it helps to look at the post here and see, all right, I worked into this one. There's clearly one more left before my chains. So I want to work actually under both loops, only in my last stitch. All the rest of them are the back loop, but in the last stitch of every row in this pattern, we're gonna work under both of the loops, and that just creates a cleaner edge. So that looks like yarning over, working under both of those loops, pulling up my loop and pulling it through those 2. Okay, again, it can be a good idea to just count your stitches, make sure you're on track. And we're now going to work row 3, which is another extended double crochet row. All of our extended double crochet rows are going to start with 2 chains. Like I said, that never counts as a stitch, so we are going to work into the very first stitch. Here's 1 chain, 2 chains. So my first stitch is right here, and we're always working under the back loop. So I'm going to yarn over, go under that back loop. I've got 3 loops here, yarn over and pull through 1, yarn over and pull through 2, yarn over and pull through 2 again. Again, that is yarn over, pull up a loop, pull through 1, pull through 2, and pull through a 3rd time. So now we actually know all the stitches for most of this pattern. We are just going to extend a double crochet in each of these stitches, and then we will work our even number rows. We're going to yarn over slip stitch in each of our stitches. At the end of row 3, I also want to work under both loops right here. So I've got this front loop, I'm ignoring that, but the loop that is next to my back loop now, I want to yarn over and then work under both of those loops and complete my extended double crochet. The way we count these rows is by saying 1, 2, and 3. So we're now going to work 7 total rows, just alternating an extended double crochet row with a row of yarn over slip stitches through the back loop. We're doing all of this through the back loop. When you have 7 total rows, we will come back here and measure our gauge and talk about adjusting hook size if we need to. When we have 7 rows complete, it should look like this. You should have 4 of these tall extended double crochet rows and then 3 of these little ridges. And I like to pop a stitch marker in here because it's not worth cutting your yarn until you know that you indeed want to save this swatch for a pocket. Typically, gauge is measured over 4 inches, and you'll see in most patterns that it tells you how many stitches should be in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So what we're going to do is measure in a couple areas of our swatch. We're going to count our stitches and see how many we have in 4 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, we want to have 8 stitches in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. It's a good idea to count in a couple places to make sure that you have the right tension going. And as long as you're measuring and you have 8 stitches, then you are good to go for your gauge width. So that means the width of each stitch is on track to match the measurements in the pattern. Let's talk about what to do if it's not on track. Now, if it's not on track and you're finding that when you count, you have too many stitches in 4 inches, that means that all your stitches need to get slightly bigger. And that would mean you want to try this swatch again with a larger hook. If you're measuring and you're seeing, oh shoot, I only have 6 or 7 stitches in here, that means all your stitches are too big, and you then need to try the swatch again using a smaller hook. So tension is completely personal. It is always fine to change your hook hook size in order to create the tension that you need to match the pattern gauge. Whatever size hook you need to in order to create 8 stitches across, that's the hook size you should use. Now let's talk about our height gauge. When we do this, again, we are going to use 4 inches as our container that we're measuring here. And some of our rows are so tall that we're not actually gonna get many rows to count here. I like to measure between 2 ribbed rows here. These are our yarn over slip stitch rows. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in 4 inches or 10 centimeters, you should be seeing 1, 2, 3 ridges and 2 of these tall extended double crochet rows. If you find that your gauge swatch is measuring correctly with the width, so you have the correct number of stitches in your 4 inches going sideways, the stitch gauge, but you're finding that your swatch is too tall or too short this way, one of the easiest ways to adjust the height is by modifying how we work the extended double crochet just a little. So you don't necessarily need to change your hook size because the stitch width is correct. One of the ways you can modify the height is just with how tall or not tall your loops are when you're working your extended double crochet. So I'm going to really exaggerate this here. I don't suggest you actually pull anything this tight or this loose, but I just want to, for effect, show you how if I pull everything quite tight with my extended double crochet, I can make this stitch a lot shorter. And what I'm doing in this case is I'm holding my yarn overs, I'm not letting them stretch out very far, and I'm kind of pinching the base of the stitch here so that everything doesn't get too loosey-goosey. Then when I yarn over, everything's a little tighter, and as a result, if I continued like that, these stitches would be slightly shorter, and that can help you reach the correct height for your gauge swatch. Now, if your gauge swatch was too short and you're realizing that you actually need a little bit taller stitches, you can do the opposite, which would just mean being a little bit more liberal when you're letting these stretch out, so that I'm gonna, again, exaggerate it so that you can see, but I'm letting these get really tall. And that is obviously going to create a taller height for each of these extended double crochet rows. So if I really stretch those out, don't do it this loose, but you get the idea. That can be a way to modify the height of your gauge swatch. And sometimes that can be easier than trying again with a different hook size. Just try again, either extending the height or shrinking the height of your extended double crochet. That's going to allow you to not enter this other variable of a new hook size, and maybe then your stitch width would be off. So that's just one suggestion, but if you are finding that your width and your height are both off by a little bit, either too small or too large, it really is worth it creating a new swatch with a smaller or larger hook to get your gauge on point so that your whole sweater turns out the size that you expect. Once you have met the gauge, then you can decide if you just want to bust out that second pocket right now. It'll take you 10 minutes and you can do that now, or you can save that for later and move on to learning how to create your front and back panels. In either case, when you know that your pocket is the correct size, we just want to fasten off, leaving a long yarn tail. So I'm going to leave about a 24-inch or 2 foot, about 2/3 of a meter yarn tail. We probably won't need all of that to sew our pocket on, but I just like to give myself some extra, and I'm going to fasten this off now. Obviously, if your swatch is not quite the right size, you can either tear it out right away, or you can keep this one and just start again with another piece of yarn. One thing is, don't cut your yarn though for the swatch that isn't the right size, because you might as well just frog it and use that yarn in your sweater. And while we're on the topic of hook size, somewhere in the middle of filming this tutorial, I just lost my mind and started crocheting with a much too large hook. So what you're going to see in some parts of this video are me using a really large hook, and my stitches are going to look big, and I don't know what I was thinking. It's totally wrong. But instead of refilming that, because all the concepts are exactly right, I went back and tore out all my sweater and remade it. But I'm going to keep that footage that uses that wrong hook size. Just know that actually that giant log of hook I'm using is not correct. You really do want to use a hook that's probably closer to a 10mm, which I'm actually using to make the sweater, or whatever hook size you need in order to match that gauge we just discussed. One of the rules we are going to use throughout this pattern is to start each chain by leaving about a 2 foot yarn tail. So we're going to save these and use them for seaming so that we don't have to attach a bunch of other seaming specific yarn. So I'm going to leave that 2 feet of yarn just dangling away for now. And then I am going to chain 39 stitches for my size. And what we're creating here is the left front, but this is the exact same skills that we're going to use to make the right back. So what I'm going to do is show you the first several rows of it. And then the only difference between the left front and the right back is just what we do at the end of the panel. So it's like the last handful of rows are worked a little bit differently. And so I'll show you specifically how to end each of these panels, but the same skills that you are going to practice right now, making your left front, are the exact same things you're going to repeat to make the right back. To begin, we're going to skip the first 2 chains. This is never going to count as a stitch. We're now going to extended double crochet into the 3rd chain from the hook. It begins just like a double crochet. So right now I have 3 loops on my hook. I'm going to yarn over and essentially just chain 1, pull up a loop like that. Again, I still have 3 loops on my hook, and I'm going to complete this as if it were a double crochet. So that was a lot of words. Let's just try it again. Yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop. Instead of finishing the double crochet like normal, you're going to chain 1. I'm not trying to get that up as high as my other loops. I'm just trying to create a little bit of a stair step there, and then yarn over and go through 2, yarn over and go through the next 2 loops. So if this stitch is a little bit taller than a regular double crochet. Again, that's just yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through the first loop on the hook, yarn over, pull through the next 2 loops on the hook, and then yarn over and pull through the final 2 loops. So we are going to extended double crochet like this in each chain until we have 5 chains left. And those 5 chains that are left are going to become our ribbing at the bottom of our panel. So let's continue doing extended double crochet in each stitch, and we'll meet back up when we have 5 chains remaining. 5 chains remaining. Now we're going to half double crochet in each of these chains. So I'm just inserting my hook, pulling up a loop, and then yarning over and pulling through all 3 loops on the hook. Again, that's yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through all 3. So it can be helpful to even put a stitch marker in these right where we started our half double crochet. So in the last 5 stitches, it can act as like a little sticky note to yourself so that when you get on a roll, you can remember, oh yeah, wait, I'm supposed to do something in these last 5 stitches. I actually need to half double crochet instead of extended double crochet. And we're going to do this throughout this panel and all the other body panels. So this is going to become very routine. I'm going to put this here. That's going to be my reminder that this is technically my ribbing. This is technically my sweater panel. Now we are going to work a row of yarn over slip stitch. So we want to chain 1 at the beginning of that row. And from here out in the entire panel, we are going to work through the back loop only. To yarn over slip stitch, we are going to yarn over and then insert our hook in the next stitch, or in this case, the first stitch, and then pull up a loop. And then this first loop is just going through the 2 loops already on the hook. That's a yarn over slip stitch. So again, yarn over, insert my hook through that back loop, pull up a loop, and pull it through the 2 loops on my hook. So a little bit faster, it can look a little bit more fluid like that. So it's yarn over, insert my hook, pull up a loop, and pull through the 2 loops right there. I'm going to just work into this stitch that has my marker in it. And if you want to be very precise, you can move your marker up to the new yarn over slip stitch that you created. Then it'll be there to remind you back when you come back in the other direction that you want to start half double crocheting. We are now going to yarn over slip stitch in each of our stitches until we get to the end of this row. And at the end of row 2, there's 2 things I want to point out. The first one is that we are going to work under both loops of our last stitch every time we get to the end of the row. So the rest of the rows, we're going to work in that back loop only, except for in the last stitch. This just creates a little tidier edge. So now I am going to work under these two loops. And I also wanted to point out sort of where the last stitch is in general, because it can all look a little mushy along this edge. If you flip it back this way, you can see that I have those two turning chains that we skipped at the beginning. And then this right here is the top of my last stitch. So this will become more intuitive, but if I were to stop here, I would be sort of quitting the row abruptly. So instead I want to yarn over, work under both of those loops, and finish my yarn over slip stitch. If you're at all unsure, just count the number of yarn over slip stitches you have. It should be the same number that you ended row 1 with. Now we're going to begin increasing, and this is the basis of the pattern and how we create the slope for the shoulders. So row 3 is going to be the same thing that we do for the rest of the odd number rows for a while. It's going to begin with a chain 2. And just like before, this does not count as a stitch. So we are going to now work into our very first stitch right here. And we're actually going to work 2 extended double crochet. So in our very first stitch, we're working through the back loop only, and we're putting 2 stitches to get started. That's where our increase is happening. And that's what's going to create the sloping shoulder panel. So I've pulled up a loop. I'm going to yarn over and pull through the first loop, yarn over and pull through the next 2. And then one more time, yarn over, pull through the last 2. So that's my first extended double crochet. And then again, in the same stitch, I want to yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through the first loop, yarn over and pull through the next 2, and then yarn over once more, and go through the last 2. Now I've officially increased right here because I've put 2 stitches where there once was 1. And now I can extended double crochet in each stitch along this row until we get back to our stitch marker down there, or until you notice that you have 5 stitches remaining in your row. And in our last 5 stitches, just like before, we're going to half double crochet, only now we're only working under the back loop. So it's half double crochet, back loop only is what it's called in these last 5 stitches. But if you remember, the last stitch of every row, we are going to work under 2 loops. So this is my back loop, and then the one next to it is the other loop I want to work my hook under. So I'm yarning over, going under 2 loops, pulling up a loop, and then finishing my half double crochet. Again, if you want, you can move your stitch marker up to that 5th stitch so that you remember to work in half double crochet when you get back there. And just like in row 2, in row 4, we're going to chain 1 and then yarn over slip stitch in each stitch. Again, we're only working under the back loop. One more time, I want to point out where the last stitch of row 4 is. It's a little hard to see because it's sliding downward a little, but it is this V right here, right before my 2 turning chains. So I want to make sure and get that stitch so my stitch count remains correct. And I'm going to work under both loops since it's the last stitch of my row. So again, if in doubt, count your stitches and compare them to the number in the pattern. We just increased in row 3, so we should have 1 more than we did before. And we're going to continue increasing now for several more of the extended double crochet rows, so the odd number rows. To start that, I'm just going to remind you, and then you already actually know how to do this. We're going to chain 2, and then in the very first stitch, I'm going to put 1 extended double crochet. That's my first one. And then I want to put another stitch in the same spot. So the same place, we're going to put another extended double crochet. And now we have increased. And then we're going to continue working along this back bump. So we're only inserting our hook under this back loop, the one that's furthest in the back. This is what's going to create a bit of a vertical, almost knit look up and down vertically in our panels. We're kind of leaving those loops there while we only work through the back loop. And from here, we want to continue to extended double crochet in all of our stitches until we get to the last 5. Then we're going to half double crochet, making sure we work under 2 loops in our last stitch. And then we're going to turn around and work in the opposite direction with yarn over slip stitches. back this way. That's all of our even number rows are always yarn over slip stitches. And then you're going to repeat what we did in row 3 and what we're doing here in row 5, where you start the row with an increase with 2 extended double crochet, and then you're going to work back this direction, working 5 half double crochet at the end. So you can repeat this sequence however many times you need to for your pattern. And like I said, the left front and right back are exactly the same up until the last several rows. So regardless of which one you're working here, I'm assuming we're all starting with the left front. Although if you're left-handed, that's your right front, but we're all starting with that piece. So then I'll show you how to finish a front panel and also how to finish a back panel, because they're very similar until those last few rows. So let's work several more increase rows and yarn over slip stitch rows, and then we'll come back here and talk about the next steps. After working your increases, you are going to get to a point where it's now time to either create collar ribbing if you're working on a front piece, or work some rows even, which means without increasing if you're working on the back panel. So I'm going to first show you how to do the collar ribbing, and then next I'll show you how to do those working even rows. And the concepts apply on both the right and left side of your sweater. So once you learn these, they're very easy. Then you'll know when you get to that section of the pattern for each panel, this is how you'll do it. Now that we're just working on the collar ribbing, I do not need the stitch marker anymore. So if you still have yours, you can take it out, and we are just going to yarn over slip stitch in each stitch. You should have ended with a yarn over slip stitch row, and we're now going to just yarn over slip stitch in the back loop of each stitch for more rows. So it's very easy. I've chained one, and then just like we've been doing all along, I'm just working that same yarn over slip stitch in the back loop. And then we're still going to work under 2 loops when we work our last stitch. That is throughout the pattern. At all times, we're working under 2 loops in our last stitch. So I'm just completing that row of yarn over slip stitch. Then again, I'm going to just do the same thing back in the opposite direction. After you have worked 2 of the rows of the ribbing section, you get to decide if you would like to add buttonholes in row 3. So I have placed some stitch markers here, and this is my right front. If you want to put the buttonholes on the side that would be the traditional female buttonhole side, you're going to put them on the right side of your sweater. If you want them on the traditional male or masculine side, then you're going to put the buttonholes on the left side of your sweater. In either case though, what I have done here is counted from the bottom edge. This is the ribbing here. I've counted and put a stitch marker in the 5th stitch, and then I've counted and put another stitch marker in the 6th stitch, counted again in the 6th stitch, and again in the 6th stitch. So obviously you can play around with how many buttons you want to have in your sweater and the exact placement that you want to have, but I have found that about 5 stitches between each button works well. And whether you're right or left-handed, this is going to basically work the same, whether you're working from this direction or this direction. What we're going to do is yarn over slip stitch just as we have been. I'm chaining 1 to get started here, and then I want to yarn over slip stitch just like we would in any other ribbing row. We're going to do that until we get to our first marker. So I worked in the stitch right before the marker. It's a little hard to see, but this is my marked stitch here. So I want to skip over that stitch. And when I'm skipping over it, I'm going to chain 1, and then again, yarn over slip stitch in the next stitch. So what we've done right here is created a little hole. If you were just learning how to crochet, this would be terrifying and probably mean you made a mistake, but this is an intentional hole. So again, then I'm just yarn over slip stitching in the back loop until I get to my next stitch marker. And then I've worked into the stitch right before that stitch marker. So I'm ready to make another buttonhole. I'm just going to chain 1 and then skip over that stitch marker, put my hook in the back loop of my next stitch, and yarn over slip stitch. And then you can proceed like that, making a buttonhole at each place where you have put a stitch marker. And then you can just continue for the rest of the row, just working typical yarn over slip stitches in the back loop, just as we have been. After our buttonhole row is complete, that's row 3, we just want to continue working 3 more rows of yarn over slip stitch in the back loop. So as you come across your buttonhole chains in row 4, like I am right here, I want to point out how it can be easy to miss a stitch because the chain and the stitch that comes before it kind of merge into each other. So you just want to make sure that you're working under the loop of each stitch like this. So that's one, and then I've got that chain. I want to make sure I work under the back loop of it. And I'll show you again in the next buttonhole. Because of the way they kind of squish together, can be easy to miss them. And then you'll end up with too few of stitches in row 4. So again, I've come upon that chain and I just want to work in the back loop. And then the next one, that is another back loop, I want to work a yarn over slip stitch under there. And you can always count your stitches at the end of row 4 and just make sure that you have the correct number, the same number that you had at the end of your front section. Here I am again at another buttonhole. So you see I've got two sort of like, I have 2 back loops here that all kind of look like they're part of the buttonhole, but actually one is the stitch before it. So I want to work under that loop. And then again, I want to work under the back loop of the chain. The gist here is just making sure you're putting a stitch in every stitch from the last row, including the chain spaces. And then we want to carry on. After we've worked row 4, we need to make 2 more rows of yarn over slip stitch because we're going for 6 rows in our ribbing section. And if you remember, that last row of our front is a yarn over slip stitch row, so I'm not counting that as my 6. If we include that, then technically we're gonna have 7 consecutive rows of yarn over slip stitch. That's when you'll know your ribbing is complete, and you can just fasten off, leaving a long tail. You shouldn't need it for seaming, but just in case, you can leave yourself that. And then when you're working your second front that doesn't include buttonholes, you're going to do all the same steps, just omit those chain spaces. So you are going to wanna work 6 rows of yarn over slip stitch through the back loop only. After you finish your front, you're gonna do those 6 rows and then you can fasten off and your second front will also be complete. When you've completed all your increasing rows and you're ready to work some additional rows for your back panels, this applies to both the right and left-handed sides. All we're going to do is work some rows without increasing. So this is the simplest thing you're going to learn in this entire video, because without increasing just means that when we're starting or finishing the extended double crochet row, where typically we've been increasing in it. In this case, I've been increasing at the beginning of my rows. Now I'm just not putting 2 stitches in my first stitch. So I've started with 2 chains just as before, and I'm just going to work 1 extended double crochet in my first stitch. It's quite straightforward. And then again, I'm going to put an extended double crochet in the next stitch. And just like that, I'm going to work across the row. We're going to continue putting half double crochets in our 5 stitches. So even if you're working on the panels that slope the other way and you've been working your increases at the end of the row, we're just eliminating that increase part now. The result of that should be that you're creating rows that look just like this, but now your panel is starting to have a flat edge where it was typically sloping before. So the number of rows that you're working for your working even rows may depend on your size. You can check the written pattern for that, but what you should end up with is this slant should start to flatten out. You're going to maintain this ribbed texture, just alternating extended double crochet rows with yarn over slip stitch rows. You'll work the total number of rows that you need for your working even section. And then you can just fasten off, leaving a long tail because we're going to use that for seaming our back panels together. As before, I've left myself about 2 feet of yarn tail. That is about 2/3 of a meter. And I want to explain what's happening in this panel because for our right front and our left back, we're using all the same skills. We're still increasing, we're extended double crochet and yarn over slip stitching. The difference here is that in our other panels, we were beginning the rows with our increase and then finishing the rows with half double crochet. At least the odd number rows. Now we're going to begin the row with half double crochet, and then we're going to end the rows with extended double crochet and eventually our increases. So we're just kind of reversing the exact same thing we did in the other panels. The way that that is going to look is that we're going to skip our first chain. That's not counting as a stitch. And then we want to half double crochet into the next 5 chains. So we want 5 half double crochet, just like we did in the other panels. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Here's my little sticky note to myself to remember that that is where in this case, I kind of want to remind myself, okay, now it's time to extended double crochet for the rest of the row. So we are just going to do that same thing, extended double crochet in each of these stitches. We're not increasing at the end of the first row. We're just setting it up. So you're just putting 1 extended double crochet in each chain to the end of our row. You should have something that looks like this now, 5 half double crochets down here, and then the rest are extended double crochet. And I suggest just counting your stitches here because honestly, if a mistake happens here, your stitch count is going to be off for the rest of the entire panel. And what I just found is my stitch count was off, so I had to tear this out and do it again. I was chatting with you instead of counting, apparently. So to begin our row 2, we're doing the same thing we did in the other panels in row 2 and all the other even number rows. So we are simply yarn over slip stitching in the back loop of every stitch. And then when you get to that last stitch of the row, you're going to work under 2 loops instead of just 1. To begin row 3, we want to chain 1. And this is where we're going to start doing things slightly differently than we did in our other panels. If you remember here, we want to start with half double crochet. So we're going to half double crochet through the back loop in the first 5 stitches. And then we still need to increase, just like we did in our other panels. We're just going to do it now at the end of the row. So the last stitch of the row is where our increase is going to happen. That means we need to just do business as usual in each stitch until we get there. So that's 5 half double crochets at the beginning of the row and then an extended double crochet in each stitch until we get to that last stitch of the row. At the end of our row, it's increase time. So in this case, we are still going to work under both loops. And that just looks like putting our first extended double crochet there, working under both loops. And that's 1. And then we want to do the same thing again in the exact same stitch. As you can see, we're creating the same shape that we did in the other panels. We're just doing it in reverse now. That's what's going to allow us to have symmetrical halves of our sweater. At this point, you can carry on working several rows just as you did in the other panel. We're just repeating this version where we're increasing at the end of our odd number rows. And just like in the other panels, we are going to use these skills and this shape to create both the right front and the left back. So you can be thinking about where you want this color to fall. And just as you did before, you're going to use yarn over slip stitch to complete your collar ribbing on your front panel. And then on the back panel, you'll work a few rows without increasing at all. We call those working even. You already know how to do that. So you're going to do the same thing in this back panel as you did in the previous one. And when all of those are complete, you should have 4 total panels, 2 of them that slope toward the left, 2 of them that slope toward the right, and those 4 panels should sort of look like mirror reflections of each other. Our sleeves are made with a lot of the same skills we just used to make the backs and the fronts. And what we're going to do, for my size, I'm starting with 31 chains here, and I'm immediately going to increase. So this is the same skill we used to create that slope for our shoulder, but we're going to start doing our increases immediately. So I'm skipping the first 2 chains, and then I want to extended double crochet into that 3rd chain from the hook. And then instead of moving on to the next chain, I'm going to work a 2nd extended double crochet in my 3rd chain. So that creates my increase. And now I just want to extended double crochet in each stitch until I have 7 remaining in this chain. With 7 chains left, we are going to work some shorter stitches, just like we did in our backs and fronts. This is going to serve as the ribbing at the end of the sleeve. So this is going to be the ribbed cuff. To do this ribbing, we want to first work 2 half double crochets. So this is a shorter stitch than our extended double crochet. But in the case of the sleeve, we're going to then finish with an even shorter stitch. So we've got 2 half double crochets, and now we're going to work in the rest of the stitches, the next 5, we're going to work a single crochet. So you can see here my piece is already going from tall stitches to slightly shorter stitches to the shortest stitches. And again, I suggest putting a stitch marker here to mark our 7th stitch. And this will just remind us as we come back, this is where we're gonna start making the cuff. We don't lose track and get on a roll and make all those extended double crochets. So now working back in the opposite direction, we're going to do the same thing we've always done in our even number rows, and that is yarn over slip stitch through the back loop. So this is very familiar at this point. We're going to do this in each stitch to the end of the row. As before, I want to work under 2 loops for my last stitch of the row. And now what follows is exactly what we did in one of our backs and one of our fronts. And that is we're going to increase at the beginning of each row for a little while. So that again looks like putting 2 extended double crochets in my very first stitch. What we're doing here is we're going to create a sleeve shape that slopes up at the shoulder and then down at the shoulder, and that's going to create a nice sleeve that sort of sits into our armhole without creating too much extra bulk. One of the hazards when you're using thick yarn like this is that it can become too bulky, and I really wanted to avoid that in this design. I wanted a pattern we could make really quickly in a weekend, but that wouldn't feel like it's so uncomfortable you don't want to wear it. So that's what some of the sloping is about. It really should fit your body and your proportions of a human body very well, and I hope you just find it so cozy, and honestly, you could be wearing it by tonight. To continue, we are going to work a few more of these increase rows separated by rows of yarn over slip stitch. So let's go ahead and work the number of rows that you need to for your size, and we'll meet back here and talk about what to do at the middle of the sleeve. This is what it looks like when the increasing rows are complete. I have this slant going upward, and I have worked 1 yarn over slip stitch row to finish my repeat here. So now for my size, I am going to work the next 2 rows working even. So that just means I'm going to work 1 extended double crochet row and then the yarn over slip stitches into it. Those will be my next 2 rows, and I'm not going to increase when I do my extended double crochet. So this is the same thing we did in our back panels when we worked kind of near the neck. Oops, those chains got super tight. Let's see. We want to start, as always, with 2 chains that don't count as a stitch, and then I'm just extended double crochet into the first stitch here, and then each stitch until I have 7 remaining, and then I'll do those 2 half double crochet and 5 single crochet. And then work back in the opposite direction with a yarn over slip stitch in the back loop of each stitch. Your size might include another set of rows worked even, so you may have one more extended double crochet and one more yarn over slip stitch row to work even. Now I'm going to head into my decrease rows, which means we're going to mirror the slant that's going up the sleeve this way. We're going to mirror it going down that way. And a decrease is just the opposite of an increase. An increase, we're creating 2 stitches where there was once 1, and a decrease, we're turning 2 stitches into 1. So we're merging them. So we're going to call this an extended double crochet 2 together. What that means is we're taking these 2 stitches and we're crocheting them together. So I'm again starting with a chain 2, and then I'm yarning over as usual, inserting my hook in that first stitch, pulling up a loop, yarning over like that, and then yarning over again. So I've completed my extended double crochet most of the way, and now I want to yarn over in the next stitch, pull up a loop, work through the first loop on my hook, work through the second 2. Now I have 3 loops on my hook, and I can yarn over and pull through all 3 of those. So what just happened here is we took these 2 stitches, we worked them most of the way, but finished them together, so we merged them into 1 stitch. I'm going to tear this out and just show that one more time, because there's a lot of loops and a lot of steps, but it doesn't have to be very complicated. So we're going to yarn over, insert my hook in the first stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over as we would with an extended double crochet, and then yarn over and pull through the first 2 loops on my hook. So we're at the last step of an extended double crochet, and instead of continuing, we're going to yarn over and put the hook in the next stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through, just as if we were completing a separate extended double crochet, and then yarn over and pull through the next 2 loops. So at this point, I have these extended double crochets both kind of paused as if they're almost finished. I have 3 loops on my hook, and then I want to yarn over and pull through all 3 of them. As you can see, this is now the top of my stitch, so this will be my last stitch that I work into when I'm coming back the opposite direction. I just need to work one of these decreases, and now I'm going to extended double crochet in each stitch until I have 7 left, and then I'll do my usual 2 half double crochet and 5 single crochet. In all my even number rows, I'm still going to do yarn over slip stitches, and we're going to complete a few of these decrease rows now. So each time you're doing one of these tall rows, you're going to decrease at the beginning of it. The number of rows that you're going to do is dictated for your size in the pattern. And then we're going to finish the sleeve ending with a yarn over slip stitch row. So what you should have at the end is something that slopes up, works even in the middle, and then slopes down, and it should look essentially symmetrical at the end of the sleeve. It is worth noting that the stitch count on your very last row is going to be 1 stitch less than the stitch count on your first row, and that's just how the decreases play out. But once you have your sleeve shape created, you can fasten off, again, leaving a long tail, and then use the exact same steps to create a second sleeve that's identical to the first. We are at a very exciting point because it is now a time to join our 6 pieces together into a cardigan. Now, if you've had any questions along the way, or you just want the support of friendly crocheters, I hope you'll join our Facebook group. The link is right below, and there are just the nicest crocheters there who are helpful and willing to answer questions and just cheer you on and admire your stitches. The first thing that we are going to seam is our 2 back pieces together. So you can't see all of it on camera, but I have the wrong side of my back pieces facing up. And this is the center seam where I want to join them. So it's going to be helpful here if you use one of your leftover yarn tails. I'm going to just grab the one that's at the bottom edge of my sweater. So this is where my ribbing is. And I've already pinned my back pieces together, counting every 10 or so stitches, because one of the things that's going to make this look the cleanest is if we can make sure we line up each stitch as we seam. So mine are already pinned together, and I'm going to rotate this like this so that I can use my right hand for seaming. Seaming can be one of those aspects in garments where we sort of make or break the finished look of our project. So I always like to find the ways to create seams that are the most invisible. And what I found in this project for our back seam, whip stitching is going to create a very clean and deliberate join here. So I have put tapestry needles under the loops we're going to seam in, just to show you what I'm talking about. It's the loop that is facing up, and we're only going to work under one loop in each stitch. So you can see here my needles are going through on this side closest to me. It is the loop closest to me, and then on this side opposite me, if I was holding this up, it'd be furthest away from me. The easiest way to think about this is just the top loop of each of these stitches in our last row. And then I have my leftover yarn tail threaded with my tapestry needle. So now I'm going to take these needles out because I don't need to show you that anymore. And I'm also going to remove my first stitch marker that was holding everything together. Now we're going to join this with whip stitches. And again, we're just working under one loop. So I'm going to work under this loop over here because my yarn's already attached over here. And then I'm going to go over to my second stitch on the opposite side, pull it through, and a whip stitch we just keep going through in the same direction. So now I'm going under my first loop and under my second loop, again under the first one, under the opposite one over there. As I'm pulling these, I want to make sure I don't have too loose of a seam. It can be helpful to turn it over and just see how it's looking, especially if you're using two different colors for your backs, because you don't want the seam to stretch so far apart that you can really see that seaming yarn. But also, we don't want to be pulling anything too tight. That can create a more visible seam because it can look a little bunchy. So I've reached another stitch marker. I'm going to slide that out. And then I'm just going to continue like this, whip stitching in the same direction. I'm always inserting my needle, in this case, from closest to me and then away from me, around and around until I get to the top of this seam, because I'm working from the bottom. You may be working from the top down, that's totally fine. But when you get to the end of your seam, you can just weave in this yarn tail because we're not going to need it again. And when that seam is complete, it should look like this. You can barely see it, especially because I'm using the same color here, but we have two ribs next to each other and then the seam is sort of tucked in between them. Isn't that pretty? Next, we're going to seam the shoulders. So I have laid my front on top here, making sure that I have the wrong sides together. So this is the inside of the back and the inside of the front. And I'm laying these down on top of each other, and we want to pin them so that we're lining up these rows of yarn over slip stitch. So those vertical columns, they're a good spot to line up and place a stitch marker there to hold them together. And this is what's going to help align the sort of vertical stripes of our fronts and backs together. So I am going to put a stitch marker in each of these vertical lines heading up my shoulder slant here. And then here is my front ribbing, and I'm going to line that up. It should reach over to about a vertical line right here, crossing over 2 double crochet rows. So as long as it lays out there and it's fairly flat, you're probably in good shape. I just want to give you some specific kind of mile markers here. So here is that vertical edge, and I'm just going to pin this in place right here, and that should leave 1 row of double crochet here. For my size, I have this row of double crochet. Here's my middle seam, here's that row of double crochet, and then I've got that yarn over slip stitch row right there. The reason this is important, getting this placement right, is because this is going to be the opening in our cardigan, and if it's not really positioned correctly, you could end up with too open of a neck, and that is that annoying feeling where your cardigan's about to fall off your shoulders. We don't want to have that. So we want to have the appropriate opening at the neck, and once you've pinned everything in place, you can even pin the second side, try it on, make sure that you like that opening. But we are now ready to seam along this shoulder edge, and I am just going to use this strand of yarn right here that happens to be part of my back. If you are left-handed and it's easier for you to start with this piece as part of your front, either way works. We want to use one of these existing yarn tails so that we don't have to seam it in separately. So I'm just going to pop that yarn tail onto my tapestry needle and then position this so that I'm easily able to seam it together. We're going to work this seam in a zigzag stitch, but of course, if you have a preferred seaming method that you want to use here, you should go for it. I have the right sides of my fabric still facing out, and I just want to work across here so that I'm joining my yarn in the front piece because my yarn was already attached in the back. And then to work this zigzag stitch, we are just going to go back and forth. I find it helpful to pick up more than one strand of yarn as I'm working under this row edge because one strand of yarn can just get a little bit stretched out. So as I go back and forth, I'm just scooping up 2 strands of yarn at a time, kind of like I am lacing shoes. I'm just working zigzagging back and forth, pulling this tight enough that I'm not seeing a ton of my seaming yarn, but not so tight that it starts to get clumped up. And we're just gonna go back and forth like this. When I run into a stitch marker, I can get it out of there. And as I'm going, I'm checking to make sure that those rows of yarn over slip stitch are lining up. That's gonna be our best indication that we haven't gotten off track. And as you'll see here, this turning chain, I'm just gonna work underneath it because I don't really want that popping up from my shoulder. So I'm just grabbing something that is a little bit further in. When you're working into the row edges like this, if you ever find something that you're like, oh, that did not work out very good, I wish it looked a little different, I think it's always worth it to just take your tapestry needle off, go back a few stitches, tear them out, and then just get it right, because these are the type of things that will really influence how you feel about your finished project. So I am going just like this. If you are using a highly contrasting color, so if you have a really dark color and a really light color, and you're finding that you can see your stitches too much, you can see the seaming yarn too much, then you might try going under just one strand of yarn instead of 2 like I am. But because my colors are fairly similar, it's gonna work okay for me to go under 2 strands of yarn. It does make for a little bit sturdier seam, although it's slightly more visible. It's just not gonna be that much of a deal because my yarn colors are pretty similar. We're going to continue like this, working back and forth in a zigzag until we get to, in my case, the neckline, because I started up my shoulders. I'm working over here toward where that ribbing ends in the front. And when I get there, I can just weave in my yarn tail and then repeat the same process on the opposite front. Again, it doesn't matter if you start at the shoulder or the neckline and work toward the shoulder. It just matters that you keep your rows lined up as you go. So you can complete that second seam and weave in your end. And then we'll talk about adding our sleeves. To seam our sleeve in place, first we need to put a few markers in here so that we know that everything is aligned and spaced out properly. So let me help you get oriented here. Right here, I have one of my shoulder seams. This is the same both on the right and left half of your sweater, so it doesn't really matter which is the front and which is the back here. I do have the right side of my fabric facing up though. You can tell we have these lines of V's right here. So this is the shoulder seam, this is the sleeve, and I've placed a stitch marker right here in the center of the sleeve. This should be your middle row, and this is the one that for me did not have any increasing or decreasing. So this is the one that was worked even, and if I'm not counting this one, there's not technically a middle row because we have an even number of rows here, but visually if we look at the double crochet rows and we go in like this, we're in our middle row, and that is marking where we want our sleeve to line up with our shoulder seam. So I'm just going to take this out and I'm going to pin it right there in the shoulder seam. The whole reason I take a lot of time getting this right is because I find that seams are one of the main areas where your garment can sort of fall apart in a way where you don't love the finished result quite as much. So it's, to me, super worth it to spend a little bit more time getting everything lined up correctly, making the seams as smooth as possible, because that is, in the end, the thing that ends up just being invisible and I don't think about it, or being the thing that drives me crazy about a project. So it's worth getting it right. All right, now I've counted 16 stitches from the shoulder seam in this direction and in this direction. The number of stitches you're gonna count is listed in the pattern, and it's simply dependent on the size of your sleeve. So when I'm counting, I am counting if there is a stitch in my seam, as there is right here. I'm counting that one, and then I'm going here and marking the 16th stitch. Same over here. Now, I'm sure you can guess that the purpose of this is just to show me where the edge of my sleeve needs to stretch to. And if yours is stretching a little bit to get to that stitch, as you pin it in, that's okay. What we're trying to avoid here is having the sleeve be too bunchy or something be bunched up. We don't want that, especially around your arm. So now I'm going to pin the edge of this part of my sleeve over here to the 16th stitch. And now we've got everything lined up, and for me, I like to have more than maybe necessary a number of stitch markers holding everything together. That just helps me keep things proportional and not sliding around. So I'm gonna pop a few more stitch markers in here, and then hopefully you have a long tail left over from your sleeve section. So at one of these points, right here, I have this long tail. I'm gonna be using this to do my seaming. This is like the sleeve shoulder seaming, right? This is falling right over your shoulder. So I'm just going to thread this existing yarn tail on my tapestry needle. And if you don't have an existing tail, you're just gonna wanna thread a needle and then we'll attach it and begin this seam. I've rotated my sweater around, so this is a front or back panel, and this is the sleeve. This is just an easier position for me to seam in. You don't have to have yours situated like this. And I'm going to remove the stitch marker that is holding this piece into that 16th stitch, and then insert my needle there and pull it through. I don't need that stitch marker anymore. And just like the rest of the seams that we'll talk about in this sweater, we always want to seam in a way where we're making sure we're not grabbing just one loop that may get stretched out, because there are so many turning chains along our panels. When we're working in rows like this, we don't want to just scoop up one turning chain that may not have any stability to it. So when I work under loops like this, I'm just getting part of another loop so that there's a little bit more support there. And then when I go under my double crochets, I like to just pick up these two loops. They're at the base of this double crochet, and that hides my foundation chain inside my sleeve. Of course, you don't have to do it this way. If you have a preferred seaming method and you want to do that, go for it. There's no rules about this. This is just the way that I have found creates a nice clean seam. And I'm just taking lots of little stitches here. Because of the nature of the rows of the sleeve, it's not exactly regular. Sometimes I'm working into one of our yarn over slip stitch rows, sometimes I'm working into a double crochet row, but part of the reason that we pinned the pieces together is so that we don't sort of begin to stretch one out and get misproportioned in our seam. So I am going to continue like this, going back and forth, picking up my loops, and I'm working in a zigzag. And then I'm going to seam all the way across this shoulder until I get down here to where I attach the opposite side of the sleeve. At the end of the seam, you can use this tapestry needle that's already threaded to weave in this yarn tail. This is partly why I love to leave long yarn tails and use them for seaming, because we would have to weave this in anyhow. And so we might as well use it for some seaming before we weave it in, and then we don't have to attach a different strand of yarn and weave in an extra yarn tail from the seaming yarn. So this is my little way of saving a little bit of finishing work, and it brings me a little bit of joy every time I get to skip some step that I typically find boring. Okay, so I'm going to trim that off, and then now we're going to move on to seaming the sleeve into a tube. This step is fairly self-explanatory, but we are now going to fold our sleeve panel just like that. So we're overlapping. I find that it works best to have the foundation row on the bottom and then put the last row of crocheting just slightly on top. And when we seam here, we're going to be seaming so that this last row of yarn over slip stitch sort of covers that little part of the foundation chain, and that creates an almost invisible continuation of our little ribbed V's here. So I'm going to pop a few stitch markers in here. And when we're pinning this together, the most important thing we're paying attention to is that our stitches in the last row and the first row are lined up. So in this case, I just counted 10 stitches right here, 10 stitches over here to put a stitch marker, because we just want them to go one for one as we're seaming across. I have the leftover yarn tail threaded onto my tapestry needle, and I am going to be working through these loops that are facing me. So kind of like what would be the top loops if we were going to work into this row, but because we're rotating it sideways, then what we really want is this vertical bar here. We want it facing upward and showing just like the rest of these vertical bars. That's what's going to make this seam most invisible. So what that means is when it's laying flat here, we're going to work through these two loops that are kind of intersecting this other foundation side right here. And I'm just gonna sew, it's kind of like a running stitch, back and forth. And then I'm picking up right under the post of this double crochet. I realize there's a lot of loops to look at here, but I'll show you a few times. So I'm picking up right under there. I'm going to go back through my first stitch then. The goal here is just to take little stitches, again scooping up these posts, and then I'm just going to go back through my second stitch of the last row. Now I'm working into my third stitch of that row, and under the posts of the third stitch on the opposite side. Then I like to work back up into the third stitch of my last row. I'm going to remove this stitch marker here so it's not in the way. And then work into my fourth stitch, pick up the posts of my fourth stitch on the opposite side, and then go back out of that fourth stitch. So essentially in our last row, we're going into the stitch, picking up the posts on the opposite side, and then going out of the stitch. Obviously, you don't have to do it this way. If you have a preferred seaming technique, you can definitely use it here. I've just found that this is one way to allow for this vertical ridge to sort of blend in with the rest of them and make this sleeve seam essentially invisible. So now I'm going in this stitch, picking up the coordinating stitch on the opposite side, and then going back out the same stitch on this side. And we're just going to continue like this all the way up the sleeve until we get to the underarm. And once you're there, you can weave in this yarn tail because we won't need it anymore unless you want to just continue using it for seaming down the side of your sweater, although you should have another yarn tail there to use for that, so you don't necessarily have to keep this one on. Just weave in the end while you have your tapestry needle threaded, and then next we'll move on to seaming that side. And our last seam is along the side of the sweater. So as you can see, this is my sleeve right here. This is the front, this is the back. And as with the other seams, I've already pinned this together, counting about 7 or 5 or 10 stitches up this way and up this way to make sure that my stitches on each side are aligned. And I'll show you how to work this one. It is pretty cool how it sort of zips up together. Again, I'm using a leftover yarn tail to seam this up so I can weave in the end at the same time. And as we have other times, we're just going to zigzag back and forth. In this case, we're going to be working under the post of our extended double crochet. So if you see here, this is the base of my stitches, and there's these little loops that are forming the bottom of the stitches, this is what we're going to be working into on both sides of our sweater. To begin, I'm just going to sort of attach my yarn over here because I want to get started at an even place. And now I'm going to zigzag back and forth, working under those posts that I mentioned. There's the posts on this blue side, and then I'm going to work back across under the posts on the opposite side. And the intention here is that our chain stitches, which you can see are in the innermost part of the seam, are just going to fold inside the sweater. So now I'm popping back over to the blue side, working under that post. And now on the green side, I'm working under that post. And as you tighten up your stitches, you'll see them just click into place. This is why I say it's kind of like a zipper. This one is my favorite seam of the whole sweater because it's so satisfying to watch it come together. So I'm just going back and forth, picking up these vertical loops that form the base of my post. And we're going to continue like this, zigzagging until we get up to the underarm where we've attached our sleeve. And then once again, we can weave in this yarn tail because we are done with this seam. All of these seams that we've learned here, we're going to just obviously apply the same technique on each side of your cardigan. Okay, we're almost there. Isn't this exciting? I hope you've already run to the mirror with your sweater on just to check it out and admire all your hard work. Our last step in terms of putting everything together is adding the pockets. And I want to outline what I'm doing here. Of course, you may want to position your pockets slightly differently, and I definitely recommend pinning them on and then going to the mirror and seeing if you like the placement, because depending on your size and where you want them to fall, you may want to adjust what I've done a little bit. But the basic concepts of what I'm doing here can be applied no matter where you want to put your pocket. So one of the main ideas is just making sure that we get this pocket on here evenly and that the direction of the stitches lines up with the direction of my sweater front. So in terms of the placement, I have counted up 6 stitches from the bottom of my sweater and made sure that everywhere that this pocket edge is falling, there are 6 stitches in this vertical bar of ribbing. That just makes sure that it's lined up with the bottom of the sweater and it's not sort of cattywampus. The other thing in terms of the direction this is facing is that because my stitches on this left sweater front this is the top of the stitches, this direction, I wanted to make sure to position this pocket in the same way with the top row right here toward the ribbing. If you're working on the opposite front, the important thing to know is that the top row of your stitches should be facing the ribbing and your foundation chain should be facing the side seam. From there, we are going to make sure that that foundation chain is tucked under a bar of ribbing so that then these bars of ribbing line up with the ribbing in the background. So as you've seen all along here, it's just one of those things where the eye prefers things to line up and be sort of clean and tidy. So we don't want to draw attention to anything being off kilter. And for that reason, I want to make sure that I'm getting this background bar of ribbing lined up with the pocket bar of ribbing. And one last thing, I have counted, because my pocket has 13 stitches, I've counted 13 stitches in the background on my front piece to make sure that this is not stretched out too tall or bunched up in any way. I essentially just want to ensure that it's going to lay flat and be functional and cute, but not draw attention to itself for being weird. That's what I do, not the pocket. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a yarn tail that perfectly works to seam all sides of the pocket. This is the one opportunity for you to possibly add an extra yarn tail in this entire project. What I'm going to do is use this yarn tail to seam up this side, and then this yarn tail to seam up this side, and then I will need to add a third yarn tail in order to seam across the bottom. But that's pretty good. If we only have to add one piece of seaming yarn through the whole sweater, I say that's a win. To complete my seam, I am simply going to work a running stitch where I'm inserting my needle into the top, popping it through that bottom layer, and then bringing it back like this. A running stitch is kind of the most basic sewing stitch there is. So I'm just going to work in and out like this. There's nothing fancy, it's just making sure that this lays flat and that the stitches are lined up as I seam. So I'm going, for some reason this is all tangled up in there. I'm going in and out, and I'm going to check my stitches as I work to make sure they're lined up with the stitches down below in my sweater front. But that's about all there is to this seam. It's just working in and out in a running stitch until you get up here to the top of the pocket, at which point you can fasten off, weave that yarn tail in, you won't need it again, and then we will complete the same process on the opposite side of the pocket. Last pocket seam here. I have already completed this seam. I haven't snipped this off yet, but then I've also done this seam, and you know what I did? Because I had a really long yarn tail, I just wove it down here to position it for my last bottom seam here. So I'm actually not adding a separate seaming piece of yarn, which allows me one fewer tail to weave in. I'm kind of obsessed with that, obviously. Now what I'm going to do to attach this along the bottom of the pocket is just whip stitch it in place. Of course, if there's something else you want to do, definitely do that. One of the things I'm keeping in mind as I do this is making sure that I have the same number of stitches visible here, because that's what's going to ensure that it's lined up along the bottom of my sweater. So if you don't remember way back to when we seamed those two back pieces together, a whip stitch is just working around and around in the same direction, inserting your needle one way and then repeating that same process until the end of the seam. There we go. And then you can do the same thing with your second pocket, and we will have our seaming complete. Once your ends are woven in, which shouldn't take too much time because we've already used a lot of them to sew your sweater together, the last thing, or second to last thing we want to do is lightly block our sweater. Now, even if you're using 100% man-made fibers like I am, there's a few areas where you can focus on blocking your sweater to make sure that it lays as flat and looks as good as possible. So the areas where I am focusing in my sweater are the front collar ribbing here. Because of the nature of yarn over slip stitch, doing it in several rows, it can have a little tendency to curl. So I am using a blocking board down here. You can also just use a towel on your counter or some heat protected surface. And then I am using this steamer, and you can also just use a regular iron for this and just blow steam at your sweater. You just want to make sure that you're not touching the heating implement to the yarn, because if it's a synthetic fiber, it'll cause the yarn to melt. We don't want that. So I am just going to shoot the steam from this at these areas of my sweater in particular that I want to focus on laying flat. So like I said, I'm going to be making sure I really get these front collar edges. And then the seams are another place that I want to make sure lay as flat as possible. So right now I'm steaming my arm seam right here. This is the armhole. I'll hit it with a little bit more steam, and also on the back of the sweater I want to make sure I get both sides of the seam. And then again I'm going to do the same thing at the top of the sweater where my shoulder seam is. This is one of those things where you've probably skipped this step in the past and not even thought about it, but I find that the sweater looks just a little bit better after you block it, and so it's worth taking 5 minutes to do it. Even in a super fast pattern like this, it's a relatively small amount of time to kind of upgrade the finished look of your sweater. So after you've done your blocking and let your sweater rest and dry completely, then we're ready to sew on the buttons. We are so close to finishing, I can almost taste it. Okay, our last step is to join the buttons across from the buttonholes that we created. So ideally, you still have those markers in from when you worked your buttonhole row, but if you don't, that's fine. You just look for the button. And if you can remember back to how many stitches you counted in order to leave space between your buttonholes, you're going to mimic the same thing on the opposite side. And I like to use stitch markers to remind myself exactly where I want to put my buttons, because again, it just makes everything line up a little bit better. If you followed what I suggested in this buttonhole row, we placed a marker 5 stitches in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So our first buttonhole is worked in that 5th stitch. So that means on the opposite side, I want to count up 5 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I've placed a marker here in that 5th stitch. That means that my button, if sewn on right here, will be exactly across from the buttonhole I created on the opposite side. And the place that we want to attach our buttons is in the gutter here between 2 rows of ribbing here and 2 rows over here. So it's the little ditch that is running between those. We're dividing that in half and counting up, in this case, to the 5th stitch. And then I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and placing a marker in the 6th stitch. And then again, in the 6th stitch here, and again in the 6th stitch here. That is going to mimic what I've already created over here as far as buttonholes, but of course, if you modify the placement of your buttonholes, just reflect that over here with the stitch marker placement. To attach our buttons, we want to use a thread that matches the button color and a sewing needle. And then all I'm going to do here is get my thread attached in that first marker where I want to place my button. And that is exactly where my button's going to go. So I'm just leaving that marker in place so that you can see what I'm talking about right here. And then once my thread is attached, I'm just going to scoot this out and place my button over that stitch and sew my button in place. Whether your 3 days to done cardigan was a quick finish in a weekend project like mine, or it took you a little bit longer because life always seems to get in the way, I hope you love wearing your new sweater so much. Please share some photos and tag us in them. I love to see what you make. And then when you're ready for another project, check out the rest of the 3 days to done collection for lots more fast, fun patterns just like this.